See, I wasn't lying when I said I have a lot of feelings about websites. I insist that websites are highly misunderstood entities in 2025. Since 2010, we've shrunk them down to funnels and template when in reality they're going to be the most personal and resilient corners of the web you'll ever own. But wait, there's more. Today feels like a day of reckoning for me. After designing websites for more than a decade for clients, I'm finally putting my pen to paper to design my own. So now here's a question I used to wrestle with even as a web designer. In a world where AI lets you create a website in clicks and where AI chatbots will pull in information from your website and deliver it directly to your user, what role does a website really play? Do websites even matter anymore? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that they matter more than ever. So websites have been around for more than 30 years now. And during this time, platforms have come and gone, disappeared overnight rather. There's been the social media boom and right now we're part of this AI revolution. But websites, they have been there since day one. They have not gone anywhere. They've stood the test of time. Today's video is hopefully going to tell you why I believe websites in 2025 and beyond are not just going to survive, but if done well, and done with hyper personalization and done with a story to tell, it's going to thrive. They're going to be the only owned property that is going to reflect exactly what you want it to reflect. In this world of AI hallucinations, deepfakes, they're going to be the only source of truth that someone can count on about you. If you're a small studio or an organization, you must be asking yourself, why do I need a website? But you know what? This is not the first time people are asking this question. This question came up in 2014 as well when people were posting more to LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram versus their own website. But guess what? Websites are still around. And in this video, I want to talk about why I think websites are not just going to survive 2025 and beyond, they're actually going to thrive. Websites are going to evolve into playgrounds of something more personal and more powerful than ever before. If you're an individual or a brand, your website is going to be the only source of truth going forward. That's real and verifiable in this world where misinformation can be generated with a prompt. I must say that while I say this, I am not against AI at all. In fact, if you see my other videos, I'm trying to embrace it as much as the other person. But I can't deny the importance of a property that you truly owned, that is not owned by OpenAI, that is not owned by Google, Meta, or X. A place where you're not going to be fighting algorithms, you're not going to be fighting censorship. It is owned by you, uncensored and undeniably owned by you. And so in this video, I'm going to be attempting to process all my feelings about websites in 2025 and beyond, not just as a web designer, but as an observer of the internet. For which I'm going to go into a brief history of websites, to how they've evolved to where we are today, where the website stands in, amongst other things, in the internet, and finally, who does and doesn't need a website. I honestly believe if you don't have something to say, you really don't need a website. But more about that later. What we're looking at here is the first ever website. It was created in 1991 by CERN, unsurprisingly for an academic purpose, which was sharing scientific knowledge with other scientists. In fact, this website is still live 36 years later, and you can check it out on the CERN website. So while this website came out in 1991, there were a bunch of organizations that had already booked their .com, .org, .edu domains. The reason they booked domains is because at that time, using an IP address was very non-human friendly, so they started giving names to IP addresses, and that's how domains were created. So a bunch of companies already had domains by this time, and once CERN introduced the standards for publishing on the World Wide Web, soon other companies started following suit. This is what IMDb looked like in the early 90s. Some of these images are broken because Wayback Machine couldn't load them, but bless Wayback Machine, because a lot of the images and screenshots in this presentation was possible because of its internet archive. And this is another early website from the 1990s. I deliberately included a porn reference here because I really believe that in the 90s and early 2000s, the porn industry was very instrumental in leading a lot of the invention and innovation in the World Wide Web. And so I think the porn industry has always been early adopters of every feature of the internet, including images, VR, video, etc. And so special mention to Danny's hard drive. This is an early MTV website. I've included it here only because it was very difficult to ensure that the same website loads in different browsers. So MTV actually solved this by having a decaf version which serves lightweight images, which is snappier, which is quite a vanilla version of the website. And then they had a Java version which mentions the system requirements that one would need to load such a website. It also mentions that it's not for the weak-hearted, it's not for slow access, it is for better internet. So it kind of offered both of those options to the user. I really enjoyed this website reference from the 90s just to speak about how at that time browsers weren't standardized. So what would work on one thing would not work on the other, and people had different ways to kind of work around that. The late 90s saw a lot of basic HTML websites like this one, as well as Flash websites like you're going to be seeing in the next few slides. This is the early Pizza Hut website, and you won't believe it, it came even before Google. So Pizza Hut actually launched before Google. This happened around the late 90s. They actually tried a little bit of like e-commerce, if you see, like they have the name, street address, voice phone, you continue, and then you kind of can order your pizza. So it was an interesting, it possibly was one of the first ways to kind of order things online, and that was Pizza Hut. And then we come into the late 90s era of crazy websites. And this is probably one of my favorite eras of the internet. So you remember MySpace and some of these Flash websites that cropped up? You could do everything with Flash. You could have animation, interaction, less accessibility, but it was all so beautiful. Now these are not the most accessible websites, but the individuality that each one of these carried was just something to applaud. And then we had MySpace, and MySpace was a platform similar to Facebook and Instagram back in the 90s. If you had a MySpace page, follow, but it was truly something else. As you see, no two MySpace pages look the same because they did not use a templatized approach. At that time, templates weren't even a thing. They had this loose framework, but people could customize literally everything on these pages. So while it was a platform that people posted on, it allowed for a super personal experience for each page and some more beautiful but inaccessible MySpace pages. And then Amazon launched in the 1990s, and it was the first mainstream e-commerce experience, which led to the revolution of e-commerce on the web. In the early 2000s, a bunch of things happened. The internet started moving more towards community, so we had websites like Digg and Reddit, but we also saw a lot of blogging platforms like Blogger, WordPress come to the fore. So there was this culture starting of people publishing and putting themselves out in the internet. Perhaps not through their own domain, but through these borrowed services. It wasn't common at that time for people to have personal websites. Websites were definitely seen as a thing that large corporations have or organizations have, not so much the individual. So the individual was commonly found on these blogging platforms. Another development that happened on the internet is the CSS3 specifications. Now there was no launch date for CSS3, but it kind of evolved into a very sophisticated set of specifications around early 2000s, which introduced a lot of standards to make browsers understand how we style HTML tags. And so with CSS3, you could push the visual power of HTML a lot more. Remember the Flash websites we saw in the earlier websites? Well, around this time is when people started criticizing Flash, rightly so, because it was super inaccessible, it was not compatible with many browsers, and it would require a plugin to load. While this was a great thing for accessibility, I feel the shift towards the new standards was so drastic that there was a degree of that we went from a world of hyper personalization of websites to a world where there was too much sameness. And a lot of that sameness was contributed by Web 2.0 specifications. Web 2.0 made it a little bit more accessible for people to understand how to design navigations in website, interactivity, etc. But as I said, it definitely resulted in a lot of websites looking very similar to each other, a trend that I think continues to this date. So that's it from the early 2000s. It was a crucial time for the internet and the dot-com revolution. It was only after this time that it became pretty normal to start owning a website. During this time, a lot of platforms that allow for UGC, which is user-generated content, to come to the fore. So YouTube, Twitter, and Orkut. Remember Orkut? So all of these platforms then kind of ensured that whether you had a website or not, you would kind of piggyback on these platforms to create your own profile, so that even if you didn't have a website, you did have some piece of the pie of the internet. Now, around this time was when a lot of mobile phone adoption was getting popularized as well. So there was a need to make all of these websites available on phones. And so 2010 is when responsive web design really started picking up, where people would kind of code the websites in such a way that they look different and optimized for phones, tablets, and desktops. And with this, we saw different kind of standards come to the fore, like Bootstrap. And since I was very much following the web design scene back then, I can't forget the criticism that responsive web design kind of created in the web design community, because a lot of people just decided that people can zoom into our websites. We don't need to change the layout because it loses all the essence when it's kind of rendered on a screen. I remember being part of that debate back then, but 15 years later, I have the answer: mobile first wins. So, yeah, that was a brief history of websites up till when I got into websites. These are some of the earlier websites that I created. I came from a predominantly print background, so for me to have control over the visual was so important. And during that time, I was definitely playing a lot with the excitement of just working with the internet. 2014 to 2017 are my early years of creating websites. I've been creating websites for about 10 years now, but this is the era where I learned to code. I started understanding what it means to animate things online, what accessibility means online, and responsive web design. And I started taking all those principles forward. But that's just about my journey. We can do another video about my journey some other time. And when I finally create this new website that I'm talking about, you will get to see a sneak of my personality and all of my recent work, I promise. So now enough geekery about websites and their history. I can do a full video about it. I've kind of withheld myself from sharing too much. Like, for example, did you know Google was called Backrub? But anyway, so coming back to the main point of the video, to understand the role websites play today, it's important to see the internet as the ecosystem and look at the different components within it. As the website is one part of it, social media is one part of it, web apps are another part of it, and now AI is another part of it. So with these components kind of floating around, which one is more important? The truth is, everything is important. Everything has a purpose. The reason why people are confused about a website's purpose is because there is no higher power like OpenAI, Meta, or Google owning that property, and hence no one is kind of saying that this is where it's going to go into the future. But as custodians of people's website for a while now, I think web designers at this point are the only advocates left for websites, because they are the most autonomous piece of property amongst these components that we spoke about. So I want to explain the role that websites play on the internet with a simple analogy. I want you to think of the internet as a skyline. The skyscrapers are the big platforms like Meta, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. They're always buzzing. Think of them as these giant exhibition halls with temporary exhibits or temporary shows, something demanding your attention at every minute. But by tomorrow, that exhibit has changed. What you've seen is gone and replaced. And no one in those towers really own the rooms that they're in. Everyone's just renting space. And if you've ever been a tenant, you know that your landlord can kick you out at any time. Now look at those smaller buildings on the right. The homes, the studios, the little shops. They don't always have a crowd lining up. Sometimes they're quiet, sometimes only a few people drop by, sometimes there's music coming out of one home, there is celebration happening at the other. You can walk through these spaces, look at the objects that are collected, look at the things that one is choosing to preserve, and get a very deep sense of the people who stay in that space. In these spaces, you don't just get a passing glance, you get depth, context, and history. And this is exactly how I see a website. It is not a temporary exhibit that disappears with an algorithm, but a museum that preserves your ideas, your work, your voice, and nobody except you can take that away. If you go back to the skyline analogy, a website is never meant to be a marketing tool. That is a rented space mindset. The real value of a website is in ownership, permanence, and personality. It's never, and I say never, never about how many people flood into your website every day. It's about having a home for your ideas, your work, your voice in an uncensored, unthrottled way and in a way that's not lost in an algorithm. In fact, when I design websites, I usually work with knowledge institutions, institutions of social and cultural significance. So, by essence, those websites tend to have a lot of content, and whenever I work with them, they usually kind of show me their Google Analytics numbers and they say, hey, we're getting this much traffic. Will we get more traffic after this redesign? And I need to tell them that no, that's not the point. Just look at the journey of this visitor. Even if you look at Google Analytics, engagement is what we look at. Are people going from page to page in the way that you want to curate your story to them? It's not about attracting more people, it's about giving richness of information to the people that come there in the first place, because anyone who comes to your website is already motivated, and going forward they're going to be even more motivated because they don't need to come to your website. An AI can pull information from your website and feed it to the user. So a person coming to your website in 2025 and beyond is going to be highly motivated to learn more about you. And when you welcome them, you better give them an experience or a taste of what you have to offer, because they're here to know. Now, here's why I think a lot of people are getting websites wrong. We often treat websites like digital billboards or brochures, something you launch once and leave it there forever. But that was never the point of websites. Websites were never meant to be static monuments. Think about it. If you were a print designer, you send your file for print. Once you see any changes, you're like, oh man, I just did a print run of 2000 copies and I can't change it because it's already gone for print. Websites never lock you out. They never tell you you are not going to be able to make any change. You are constantly able to make changes. So when someone says they've launched their website, that doesn't mean they're done. It means they've launched the first public facing version of their website and they're going to keep iterating on it. In essence, a website is always going to be a forever work in progress. It is never meant to be a static monument. It was always meant to be a living, breathing space. Now going to the part of the video where I talk about who websites are not for. The short answer is website is not for everyone, and I must admit that. If you're an individual or an organization that has a body of work, that has something to say, something to sell, and has a story behind it, then absolutely you need a website. The website then becomes your space to shape and preserve what you own. But if what you're doing is purely commoditized, for example, if you're selling something that's competing on price alone, with no story, no perspective, no identity behind it, then a website may not be the thing that you really need. Marketplaces may serve you better because your goal then is more about optimizing transactions and not so much about building meaning or preservation. So, in sum, a website is for those who want to be understood and not just found. So, what does it mean to have a website in 2025 and beyond? First off, websites are not relics. After 36 years of the first website launching, they still remain the only internet property you truly own. There has to be a shift in how we look at websites. In 2025 and beyond, the website needs to be treated less like a template and more like a digital home or a playground that you want to invite people into to understand you and your story, whether you're a brand or an individual.